There's a shark alive in the Arctic Ocean right now that was born before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. And there's a tree in California so old the government has hidden its exact location. These are the oldest living things on Earth, organisms that have been alive for centuries, millennia, and in one case, billions of years. So in this video, I'm counting down the 15 oldest living things still on Earth today. Number 15, the Greenland shark. In 2016, a team of marine biologists led by Julius Nielsen at the University of Copenhagen published a study that changed what we thought we knew about vertebrate lifespans. They'd been studying Greenland sharks, slow, deep-water predators that cruise the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic and Arctic Ocean. And they found that one of the females they examined was, by best estimate, around 500 years old. 500 years. That's older than the Reformation. Older than the first European contact with North America. The method they used wasn't traditional ring counting because sharks don't have bones. Instead, they used radiocarbon dating on proteins in the eyelen's nuclei, tissue that forms at birth and doesn't change. The technique carries a margin of error of roughly plus or minus 112 years, which means the oldest individual in the study could have been anywhere from 372 to 512 years old. Even at the low end, that's extraordinary. Greenland sharks grow at about 1 centimeter per year. That is so slow it took decades just to establish the growth rate with any confidence. They reach sexual maturity at around 150 years old, which means a shark born in the 1500s wouldn't have been old enough to reproduce until the mid-1600s, somewhere around the time of the English Civil War. They don't look ancient. That's the thing. They look like any other large shark. Gray, heavy-bodied, about 4 to 5 meters long when fully grown. They move at a top speed of around 1.6 miles per hour, which is slower than a person walking. They live in water that drops below 0 degrees Celsius. They're often found with parasitic coat pods attached to their eyes, which makes most of them partially or fully blind. At the top of their range, the deepest, coldest water, they've been documented at depths of around 2,300 meters. Down there, there's no light, there's almost no food, and yet they persist for centuries doing almost nothing quickly. The oldest verified individual in the Nielsen study was estimated at around 500 years old, born somewhere around 1525, roughly when Henry VIII was in the middle of his reign and Copernicus was still working out that the Earth orbited the Sun. She's still out there, probably, moving at 1.6 miles per hour through water that's barely above freezing. On this list, she's one of the youngest things here, 14. Jonathan the tortoise, still eating on St. Helena. On the island of St. Helena, a British overseas territory sitting alone in the South Atlantic Ocean, roughly 1,100 miles from the coast of Africa, there's a tortoise named Jonathan who is, by current best estimate, approximately 190 years old. He arrived on the island in 1882, shipped from the Seychelles as a gift to the governor. He was already described at the time as fully mature, which puts his birth at around 1850 or earlier. A photograph taken between 1882 and 1886 shows him grazing on the grounds of Plantation House, the governor's official residence. He's been there ever since. The photograph is one of the oldest known images of any living animal. Jonathan is a Seychelles giant tortoise, Aldebrichelys gigantea hololissa, a subspecies once thought extinct in the wild. He weighs around 180 kilograms. His shell is roughly a meter long. He's been living on the grounds of Plantation House for so long that the building has effectively been built around his routine. He is blind. He's lost his sense of smell too. His beak has softened with age, so the island's veterinarian, Joe Hollins, hand feeds him a weekly mix of fruits and vegetables. Bananas, apples, cabbage, cucumber. Hollins has been doing this since around 2009, when it became clear Jonathan could no longer forage effectively on his own. But yeah, he's still going. He still responds to the warmth of the sun, still moves towards sound, still shows enough interest in the other tortoises on the grounds that his keepers have noted he remains socially active. His caretaker says he shows no signs of slowing down, which for a tortoise is a relative observation. The grounds of Plantation House sit at an elevation that gives a clear view across the island toward the South Atlantic. Jonathan has been looking at that view, more or less, since before the American Civil War, since before the internal combustion engine existed, since before the telephone. In 2022, Guinness World Records confirmed him as the oldest known living land animal on Earth and the oldest tortoise ever recorded. The previous record holder, a tortoise named Tui Malila, died in 1965 at an estimated 188 years old. Jonathan has since passed that. He was born, best estimate, around 1850. That puts his birth during the reign of Queen Victoria, when Britain still controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface, and the American West was largely unmapped by European settlers. Plantation House is still the official residence of the governor of St. Helena. Jonathan still lives on the lawn. He has outlasted every governor who has ever lived there, all of them, by a significant margin. At number 13, the bowhead whale, oldest mammal in the sea. Deep in the Arctic and subarctic waters that ring the top of the world, there's an animal that was alive during the Napoleonic Wars and is, in all likelihood, still alive right now. The bowhead whale, Balaena mysticetus, is the longest-lived mammal on Earth by verified record, with individuals confirmed at over 200 years old. The age verification method here is unusual. Researchers don't use growth rings or radiocarbon dating of soft tissue. They use aspartic acid racemization, a chemical process that measures changes in amino acids in the eye tissue of the whale. The technique was developed in the 1980s and applied to bowhead whales in a landmark study published in 1999 by researcher Jeffrey George and a team from the Alaska Department of Wildlife Management. One male examined in that study was estimated at around 211 years old. Born, by that calculation, somewhere around 1799. The same year Napoleon seized power in France. But yeah, there's another piece of evidence that's even harder to argue with. When Inuit hunters harvest bowhead whales in Alaska, they occasionally find old stone and ivory harpoon tips embedded deep in the blubber and muscle tissue of living animals. Not modern harpoon tips. Pre-commercial era tips, the kind that haven't been manufactured or used since the mid-1800s. The wounds had fully healed around them. The whales had been carrying those points for over a century, sealed inside living tissue. Bowhead whales are enormous. Adults reach between 14 and 18 meters in length, roughly the size of a city bus and a half, and can weigh up to 100 tons. They have the largest mouth of any animal on Earth, capable of filtering massive quantities of Arctic krill and small crustaceans. Their skulls are reinforced and dome-shaped specifically to break through Arctic sea ice, up to 60 centimeters thick, which they do regularly to breathe. They're slow. Top swimming speed is around 12 miles per hour, though they typically cruise at considerably less. They spend their entire lives in some of the coldest, most remote ocean on the planet, following seasonal ice edges between the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort, and Greenland seas. What researchers have found looking at the genomes of bowhead whales is a set of genetic variants associated with DNA repair and resistance to cancer that don't appear in shorter-lived mammals. The biology of extreme longevity in this species is still being actively studied. The mechanisms aren't fully understood. The 211-year-old individual from the 1999 study would have been born before the first steam-powered locomotive ran on a public railway, before the stethoscope was invented, before the word biology was even coined as a term. Researchers estimate there are around 10,000 bowhead whales in the Bering Chukchi Beaufort population alone. Some unknown portion of them are over a century old. Nobody knows exactly how many. That count has never been done. 12. The clam they killed while trying to find out how old it was. Off the north coast of Iceland, in the cold, shallow waters of the continental shelf, there's a clam. Or rather, there was one. In 2006, a team of researchers from Bangor University in Wales dredged it from the seabed as part of a routine oceanographic survey. It was an ocean quahog, Arctica islandica, a species known for longevity, but not like this. They counted the growth rings on its shell. Each ring represents 1 year, the same principle as a tree. The count came back at 507 rings, born by that reckoning in 1499, the year before the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral reached Brazil. The year Henry VII was still on the English throne. They named it Ming, after the Chinese dynasty that was ruling at the time of its birth. The irony was not lost on anyone. To determine the clam's age, they had to open the shell, which killed it. Ocean quahogs are not rare. They live across the North Atlantic in large populations, burrowing into sandy and muddy seabeds at depths between 25 and 500 meters. They're commercially harvested. You've almost certainly eaten one without knowing it. Clam chowder, clam sauce, canned clams. The species is that common. What makes Ming unusual isn't the species, it's the individual. Most ocean quahogs live between 100 and 200 years. 507 is an outlier so extreme that when the Bangor team first published their count, there was scientific debate about whether they'd miscounted. A subsequent reanalysis using more precise techniques confirmed the number and actually revised it slightly upward. The final verified age was 507 years, published in a paper in 2013. The shell itself is now held at the Bangor University Natural History Collection. It looks like any other quahog shell, roughly the size of a large fist, gray-brown, unremarkable to look at. The rings are visible under magnification, 507 of them, each one a year of filtering seawater on the Icelandic shelf, doing essentially nothing else. What the researchers are actually interested in isn't the age itself. It's what Ming's biology might tell us about the mechanisms of longevity. Ocean quahogs produce very low levels of reactive oxygen species, which are associated with cellular aging. Their cells show unusually high resistance to oxidative stress. The working hypothesis is that this biochemical stability is what allows individuals to reach extreme ages. That research is ongoing. Ming spent 5 centuries on the sea floor. Through the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the entire colonial period, both world wars, the moon landing, filtering, closing, opening, filtering again. The shell is in Wales now, in a drawer, labeled and cataloged. 507 years old, and it doesn't look like much, and it never did. The Langernew Yew, number 11, in a small churchyard in the village of Langernew in North Wales, population a few hundred, the kind of place most people drive through without stopping. There's a yew tree that was already ancient when the Romans arrived in Britain. Current estimates put its age somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. That's not a typo. It was a sapling around 2,800 BCE, roughly 300 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was completed. The tree predates written Welsh. It predates the Celtic languages spoken in the region today. It was old before any of that existed. Yew trees are notoriously difficult to date precisely because their trunks hollow out as they age, destroying the inner rings that dendrochronologists normally count. The Langernew yew has no intact core left to sample. The age estimate comes from a combination of girth measurements, known yew growth rates, and comparison with other ancient yews of documented age across Britain. The trunk at its base is so wide it takes several adults linking hands to encircle it. The bark twisted and deeply furrowed, the wood inside long since gone. The tree is still alive, still producing needles, still generating new growth at its outer edges. Yews do this. They don't really die in the conventional sense. They hollow, they split, they send out new stems from old wood, and they keep going. The Langernew yew has been doing this for so long that the churchyard of St. Digon's Parish Church was effectively built around it sometime in the 6th century CE. The church is medieval. The tree is prehistoric. There are fragments of the original trunk still standing, massive, separate-looking sections that were once a single organism, now spread across a corner of the churchyard like ruins of something larger. New growth emerges from the old wood. The boundary between what's dead and what's alive in this tree is genuinely unclear. In 2002, the Langernew yew was named one of the 50 Great British Trees by the Tree Council to mark the Golden Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. It's a listed monument. There's a small interpretive sign nearby. Visitors come specifically to see it, though from the road the churchyard looks like any other small Welsh parish. The tree is toxic. Yew foliage, bark, and seeds contain taxine alkaloids, lethal to most mammals in sufficient quantity. It has been poisonous for the entirety of its existence. Every human civilization that has risen and fallen in Britain during its lifetime has known this about yews and built churchyards around them anyway. The association between yews and places of burial in Britain goes back further than Christianity. 4,000 to 5,000 years old, still growing, still poisonous, still standing in a village in North Wales that most people have never heard of. The sign next to it is newer than the church. The church is newer than the tree by about 1,500 years. 10. The Posidonia seagrass, 100,000 years and still spreading. Beneath the clear blue water of the Balearic Sea, between the Spanish mainland and the islands of Ibiza and Formentera, there's a seagrass meadow that has been growing since before modern humans reached Europe. Not the same meadow that started, the same plant. One continuous clonal organism spreading outward by rhizome across the seafloor for an estimated 100,000 years. The species is Posidonia oceanica. It's not algae. It's a true flowering plant, one of the few that evolved to live entirely underwater. It produces flowers, fruit, and seeds. It has roots, stems, and leaves. It looks underwater, like a dense lawn of flat green ribbons, each blade roughly 30 to 40 centimeters long, swaying in the current above a thick mat of dead leaf material called mat that builds up over centuries on the sea floor. The age estimate, up to 100,000 years, comes from genetic analysis conducted by a team of researchers led by Sophie Arnaud-Hayond, published in 2012 in the journal PLOS ONE. The team sampled Posidonia meadows at over 40 sites across the Mediterranean and found that the Balearic population showed almost no genetic variation across a span of roughly 112 kilometers. The conclusion? It's one individual, one plant, reproducing almost entirely by clonal spread, not by seed. 100,000 years. That puts the origin of this organism somewhere in the middle of the last ice age. When sea levels were lower, the Mediterranean coastline looked different, and Neanderthals were still alive in Europe. Posidonia grows slowly, about 1 to 6 centimeters per year laterally. At that rate, covering 112 kilometers takes an extraordinary amount of time, which is part of how researchers validated the age estimate. The growth rate and the genetic data converge on the same number. The meadow is a critical ecosystem. It produces oxygen, stabilizes sediment, provides habitat for hundreds of species of fish and invertebrates, and absorbs carbon. It's also protected under European Union law. Posidonia meadows are a priority habitat under the EU Habitats Directive. Anchor damage from boats has been a documented problem for decades. The plant recovers at roughly the same rate it grows, slowly. If you're snorkeling off Formentera in clear conditions, you can see it directly below you. A dark green carpet covering the seafloor and water, anywhere from 1 to 35 meters deep, stretching in every direction. It doesn't look ancient. It looks like grass. But yeah, that grass was there before. The Sahara was a desert. Before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth. Before the last ice age ended. If you're enjoying the video, drop a like and a comment. It really does help the channel out. 100,000 years old, still growing at 1 to 6 centimeters per year, still producing oxygen, still covering the seafloor between two Spanish islands that didn't have names yet when this plant began. 9. Gran Abuelo, the oldest tree with a verified ring count. Deep in the temperate rainforest of Alerce Costero National Park in southern Chile, past trails that stay wet year-round and through stands of trees so tall they block most of the sky, there's a Fitzroya cupressoides, a species known locally as Alerce, that is 3,647 years old. That age isn't estimated, it's counted. Ring by ring, core sample by core sample, verified by dendrochronologists over multiple studies. 3,647 years. It was a seedling around 1600 BCE, roughly a century before the fall of Troy, if the traditional dating of that event holds. before the Phoenician alphabet existed, before iron smelting was widespread anywhere on Earth. Fitzroya cupressоides is the second largest tree species in the world by volume, after the giant sequoia. Gran Abuelo, which translates simply as great-grandfather, stands about 60 meters tall. The trunk at its base measures roughly 4 meters in diameter. The bark is reddish-brown, deeply furrowed in long vertical strips, and shed in thin flakes that accumulate around the base. The wood is extraordinarily dense and rot-resistant, which is part of why individual trees survive so long, and also why the species was logged nearly to extinction during the 18th and 19th centuries. Chilean Alerce timber was so valued that it was used as currency in colonial trade. Gran Abuelo survived because it was in a location difficult enough to reach that loggers didn't bother. The surrounding forest was heavily cleared. This one tree remained. The age was most recently confirmed by a research team led by Jonathan Barichevich of the Universidad Austral de Chile, who published updated findings in 2022. Barichevich's analysis, using a combination of ring counting on a partial core and statistical modeling to account for the hollow and inaccessible center of the trunk, suggested the tree could be as old as 5,000 years, which would make it older than Methuselah, the bristlecone pine in California. That claim is contested. The confirmed ring count of 3,647 is the verified figure. The upper estimate remains under peer review. The tree stands in a grove that stays damp and cool through most of the year, the forest floor covered in ferns and moss, the canopy dense enough that direct sunlight rarely reaches the ground. A short boardwalk trail leads visitors to a viewing platform near the base. From there, you can see the full trunk rising, massive, straight, disappearing into the canopy above. The boardwalk was installed to protect the root system from compaction. Foot traffic alone was measurably damaging the soil around the base, so they built a platform around it to keep people from touching the ground near it, because the ground itself within a certain radius of this tree is now considered worth protecting. 3,647 rings, each one a year. The count took years to complete. 8. Methuselah, the tree whose location is a government secret. Somewhere in the ancient bristlecone pine forest in the White Mountains of California, at an elevation of around 3,000 meters above sea level, there's a tree called Methuselah. It's 4,855 years old. The US Forest Service knows exactly where it is. They're not telling anyone. The location has been officially withheld since the tree became widely known, specifically to prevent vandalism. There are no signs pointing to it. The trail passes through a grove of ancient bristlecone pines, all of them gnarled and stripped and extraordinary looking, and Methuselah is somewhere among them. Visitors walk past it regularly without knowing which one it is. The age was determined by Edmund Schulman, a dendrochronologist from the University of Arizona, who cored the tree in 1957 and counted 4,789 rings at the time of sampling. That made it, at that point, the oldest known living tree on Earth. Schulman died the following year in 1958 before his findings were fully published. The tree was named posthumously. Bristlecone pines, Pinus longeva, survive at altitude because almost nothing else can. The soil in the White Mountains is dolomitic, low in nutrients, largely inhospitable. The air is dry. The winters are severe. The trees grow so slowly in these conditions that their wood becomes extraordinarily dense, resistant to insects, fungi, and rot. A bristlecone pine can be mostly dead, stripped of bark, bleached white by exposure, and still have one living strip of tissue running up one side of the trunk continuing to grow. The dead wood doesn't decay, it just stays. Methuselah looks like this. Most of its trunk is bare, pale, twisted wood. The living portion is a narrow channel of bark and needles. From a distance, it looks like a piece of driftwood that somehow sprouted. It's about 5 meters tall, roughly the height of a standard ceiling on a 2-story house. Not large, not imposing, just old. It was a seedling in approximately 2,830 BCE. By the time the Great Pyramid of Giza was completed, around 2,560 BCE, Methuselah was already 270 years old. It predates the Bronze Age in much of Europe. It was alive before the Minoan civilization reached its peak on Crete. The trail through the grove is open to visitors. The hike is roughly 7 kilometers return through open, high-altitude terrain with clear views across the Owens Valley to the Sierra Nevada range to the west. The trees around Methuselah are themselves thousands of years old. The youngest in the grove are still ancient by any ordinary standard. The oldest verified individual tree on Earth is somewhere on that trail. Nobody's marked it. Nobody's going to. Number 7. Black coral in Hawaii. 4,000 years in the dark. About 30 meters below the surface off the coast of Maui, in water cold enough that recreational divers rarely reach it, there is a black coral colony that has been growing since approximately 2000 BCE. That puts its origin around the time the earliest Bronze Age civilizations were forming in the Aegean. Before the Trojan War, if it happened. Before the Olmec civilization in Mexico. Before almost everything most people learned about in school. Black coral, order Antipatharia, is not actually black when it's alive. The living tissue is typically white, yellow, or orange. The black is the skeleton underneath, a protein-based structure called chitin that gives the order its common name. It grows in deep, cold water, away from light, in branching tree-like formations that can reach several meters in height. It looks, underwater, like a dark leafless shrub anchored to the seafloor. The 4,000-year age estimate for Hawaiian black coral colonies comes from radiocarbon dating of skeletal material, conducted by researchers including Brendan Rourke at Stanford University, whose team published findings in the mid-2000s. The method works because the chitin skeleton incorporates carbon from the surrounding water at the time of growth, allowing each layer to be dated independently. The growth rate is roughly 4 to 35 micrometers per year, so slow that a single millimeter of skeleton can represent decades of growth. To put that in physical terms, a black coral colony that's 1 meter tall and growing at the lower end of that range has taken thousands of years to reach that height. It doesn't rush. There's nothing in its environment pressuring it to. Hawaiian black coral is commercially harvested for jewelry. The black skeleton, once polished, has been used in decorative objects for centuries. Hawaii is the largest source of commercially harvested black coral in the United States, and the trade is regulated under state law. Colonies must meet minimum size thresholds before harvest is permitted. The irony is that the oldest, largest colonies, the ones most worth protecting, are also the ones most commercially valuable. The colonies Rourke's team studied were found at depths between about 30 and 500 meters. The deepest, oldest specimens were well beyond recreational diving range, accessible only by submersible. At those depths, the water temperature hovers just above freezing. There's no sunlight. The coral sits in complete darkness, adding micrometers of skeleton per year, unbothered. At the surface directly above some of these colonies, there are whale-watching boats, snorkel tours, parasailing operations, the full apparatus of Hawaiian tourism running year-round, completely unaware of what's directly below. 4,000 years old, growing at a rate measurable only in micrometers annually, still alive, still adding to its skeleton, in water that gets no light and almost no disturbance. The oldest individuals in Roark's dataset were still actively growing at the time of sampling. They're still growing now. The ancient cypress of Yazd. Number 6. In the high desert of Yazd province in central Iran, surrounded by one of the driest landscapes on Earth, there's a cypress tree standing in the courtyard of a small village called Abark that is somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. It's called the Sarv-e-Abarku, the cypress of Abarku, and it is, by most estimates, the oldest living thing in Asia. The age comes from a combination of girth measurement, known cypress growth rates, and historical documentation going back centuries. Iranian scholars have referenced the tree in texts for over 1,000 years. It appears in medieval Persian manuscripts. The precise birth date can't be pinned down. The tree long predates any written record of the region, but the lower bound of 4,000 years is considered conservative by researchers who've studied it. 4,000 years puts its origin around 2000 BCE. The earliest Egyptian pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom were ruling. The wheel had existed for about 1,000 years. Writing had been around for roughly 1,000 years. This tree was a seedling in a world where most human knowledge was still transmitted by word of mouth. Cupressus sempervirens, the Mediterranean or Italian cypress, is not a species known for extreme longevity in most of its range. Most individual trees live a few centuries. The abark specimen is an outlier so extreme it barely fits in the same category as other members of its species. The trunk at its base measures roughly 11.5 meters in circumference, wide enough that it takes roughly 7 or 8 adults linking hands to encircle it. It stands about 25 meters tall, the canopy a dense, dark column of foliage rising above the low buildings around it. The tree is a protected national monument of Iran, designated as a natural heritage site. A low stone wall surrounds its base. There's a small park around it, and the village of Abarku has effectively built its identity around the tree's presence. It appears on local signage, in tourism materials, in regional cultural references. The surrounding landscape is arid plateau, brown, flat, and treeless for long distances in every direction. The cypress stands out against that backdrop like something that has no business being there, which, by every reasonable standard, it does. It was there first, by a margin of several thousand years. Visitors come specifically to see it. The site is accessible, signposted, and open. Unlike Methuselah in California, nobody's hidden this one. It's just there, in a village courtyard in the Iranian desert, doing what it's been doing since before the Iron Age. The tree was alive during the reign of Ramesses II, during the construction of Stonehenge, during every empire that has risen and collapsed in the Middle East across 4 millennia of recorded history. All of them are gone. The cypress is still there. 5. The Antarctic glass sponge, 15,000 years under the ice. At the bottom of the Ross Sea, off the coast of Antarctica, in water that sits just above freezing year-round and receives no sunlight for months at a time, there's a glass sponge that has been alive since the end of the last ice age, 15,000 years. When this organism began growing, glaciers covered large parts of North America and Europe. Sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. The land bridge between Asia and North America still existed. Humans had not yet reached the Americas. Glass sponges, class Hexactinellida, are among the most structurally unusual animals on Earth. They're not made of soft tissue in the conventional sense. Their bodies are built from a lattice of silica spicules, essentially glass, fused into a rigid 3-dimensional scaffold. The living tissue is threaded through this skeleton in a thin layer, connected by a continuous network of cytoplasm that functions in some ways like a nervous system without neurons. The whole structure can transmit electrical signals from one end to the other in response to stimulation. They look, on the seafloor, like pale yellow or white vases. Some species form large reef structures. The largest known glass sponge reefs in the world are off the coast of British Columbia, Canada, and some of those reef structures are estimated to be over 9,000 years old. The Antarctic individuals studied for longevity are solitary specimens rather than reef builders. The age estimate of 15,000 years comes from growth rate analysis. Glass sponges in Antarctic waters grow at an extraordinarily slow pace, roughly 2 centimeters per century. That is not a typo. 2 centimeters in 100 years. A specimen that's 1 meter tall has taken approximately 5,000 years to reach that height. The oldest specimens studied, which were considerably larger, extrapolate to ages in the range of 10,000 to 15,000 years. The method carries uncertainty. Growth rates can vary with food availability and water temperature, and direct radiocarbon dating of silica skeletons is technically difficult. The 15,000-year figure represents the upper end of credible estimates, not a confirmed ring count. But even at the conservative end, these are organisms that predate agriculture. Reaching them requires a research submersible. The Ross Sea is one of the most remote and least disturbed ocean environments on Earth, designated as a marine protected area in 2016, the largest such protected area in the world at the time of designation. The sponges sit on the seafloor in near total darkness, filtering microscopic particles from the water column, 2 centimeters per century, filtering, growing, doing nothing else. The silica skeleton of a dead glass sponge persists on the seafloor for centuries after the organism dies. The living ones are indistinguishable from the dead ones without close inspection, at 15,000 years old. This is the oldest individual animal documented on this list, and it doesn't move. It never has. 4. Pando, the forest that is one tree. Spread across roughly 43 hectares of Fish Lake National Forest in south-central Utah, there is what looks like a forest of quaking aspen trees, about 47,000 individual trunks, white-barked, trembling in the wind, covering a hillside above Fish Lake. It looks like a forest. It isn't. Every single trunk is genetically identical, connected underground by a single root system, and constitutes one organism. Its name is Pando, from the Latin for I spread. It is estimated to be approximately 80,000 years old. 80,000 years. That's not a growth rate extrapolation from a small sample. The age estimate comes from genetic analysis combined with the observation that quaking aspen in this region rarely reproduce successfully from seed. The climate and soil conditions favor clonal spread almost exclusively. The root system has been expanding outward for so long in an environment where sexual reproduction is effectively suppressed that the age of 80,000 years represents the minimum time required for the colony to have reached its current extent at documented aspen growth rates. 80,000 years ago, modern humans had not yet left Africa in the migrations that would eventually populate the rest of the world. Neanderthals were still alive. The last ice age had not yet begun. Pando weighs approximately 6 million kilograms, making it the heaviest known organism on Earth by mass. The combined weight of all 47,000 trunks, plus the root system connecting them underground, exceeds that of any blue whale, any giant sequoia, any other candidate for the title. It is also by area one of the largest known organisms on Earth. The individual trunks, called ramets, live for roughly 100 to 150 years before dying and being replaced by new growth from the root system. So, what you see above ground is constantly changing. The trunks you're looking at today didn't exist a century ago. The root system underneath has been there for 80,000 years. This distinction matters. Pando isn't 80,000 years old in the way a bristlecone pine is old. One continuous above-ground structure accumulating rings. It's old the way a river is old. The water changes. The channel persists. The organism is currently in decline. Overgrazing by deer and elk, combined with the suppression of natural fire cycles that historically cleared competing vegetation and triggered new aspen growth, has resulted in a situation where new ramets aren't establishing at the rate old ones are dying. Studies published in the late 2010s documented measurable shrinkage of the colony's extent. Fencing has been installed in experimental sections to exclude grazers and allow regeneration. The results have been encouraging in fenced areas. Outside the fences, the oldest organism on Earth is slowly losing ground. 80,000 years of continuous existence. And the thing that's threatening it now is that deer like to eat the new shoots. 3. The immortal jellyfish, which has no upper age limit. Every other organism on this list is old. This one isn't old in the same way. It can't be old because under the right conditions it doesn't age. It reverses. Turritopsis dohrnii is a small jellyfish, about 4 to 5 millimeters across when fully mature, roughly the size of a fingernail, found in the Mediterranean Sea and in temperate to tropical ocean waters around the world. It was first collected and described by researchers in the 1880s. For most of the following century, nobody paid it particular attention. It was just a small, unremarkable medusa. Then, in the 1980s and 1990s, researchers studying the species in laboratory conditions noticed something that had no precedent in animal biology. When the adult jellyfish was subjected to stress, starvation, physical damage, sudden changes in temperature or salinity, it didn't die. It sank to the seafloor, its body contracted, and it reverted. Not to a larval stage, but all the way back to a polyp, the sessile colonial stage that precedes the free-swimming medusa form entirely. From there, it began the developmental cycle again, producing new medusae genetically identical to the original. The process is called transdifferentiation, the conversion of one type of differentiated cell into another. In most animals, this doesn't happen. Cells commit to their function and stay committed. In Turritopsis dohrnii, under stress, that commitment reverses. Muscle cells become nerve cells. Nerve cells become digestive cells. The organism rebuilds itself from its own existing tissue into an earlier developmental form. In theory, this cycle can repeat indefinitely. There is no verified upper age limit. No individual has been documented completing the cycle and dying of old age. The practical constraint is that the jellyfish can still be eaten, diseased, or killed by environmental change. It's not indestructible. But the biological clock in the conventional sense appears to be absent. Shin Kubota, a researcher at Kyoto University's Shirahama Aquarium and Research Center, has studied Turritopsis dohrnii extensively and successfully maintained colonies that have completed the rejuvenation cycle multiple times in controlled conditions. He published findings across the 2000s and 2010s documenting the consistency of the process. The mechanism, specifically which cellular signals trigger the reversal, is still being investigated. The jellyfish is now found far beyond its original Mediterranean range. It's believed to have spread globally through ballast water in shipping, colonizing temperate and tropical waters on multiple continents. It's not rare. It's not endangered. It's in the ocean near you, quite possibly. It's small enough to pass through most filtration systems undetected. It's been spreading for decades, and every individual that survives long enough to experience stress has the biological option of starting over. No other animal on Earth does this. Not one. The mechanism exists in this species and, as far as current research has established, nowhere else in the animal kingdom. Biologically immortal. Also about the size of your thumbnail. 2. The humongous fungus, the largest and one of the oldest organisms on Earth. Beneath the Malheur National Forest in the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon, there's a fungus. You can't see most of it. What you see on the surface are honey mushrooms, Armillaria ostoyi, fruiting bodies that appear in autumn, clustered around the bases of trees. Unremarkable looking. The kind of mushroom you'd walk past without a second glance. What's underground is a single mycelial network spanning approximately 8.9 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of 1,350 football fields, connected by a continuous web of root-like filaments called rhizomorphs, all genetically identical, all part of one organism. It was identified as a single individual in a study published in 2000 in the journal Nature, by a team led by Kathy Parks of the U.S. Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station. The team collected samples from across the forest, compared their genetics, and confirmed what the growth rate data had been suggesting. This was one thing. Not a colony, not a population. One organism spread across nearly 9 square kilometers of mountain forest. The age estimate, commonly cited at around 8,000 years with some estimates ranging higher, comes from the known growth rate of Armillaria rhizomorphs combined with the current extent of the network. Armillaria expands slowly, roughly a meter per year at the outer edges under typical conditions. Working backward from the current size gives a minimum age in the range of several thousand years. The 8,000-year figure is the most widely cited, though it carries the uncertainties inherent in any growth rate extrapolation. 8,000 years puts its origin around 6,000 BCE, when the Sahara was still a green inhabited landscape, when the first cities in Mesopotamia were just beginning to form, when the British Isles were still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge that was disappearing under rising seas. The fungus isn't passive, it's a pathogen. Armillaria ostoyi kills trees. The rhizomorphs penetrate root systems, extracting nutrients from living wood and killing the host. The honey mushrooms that fruit each autumn are the reproductive phase, the visible tip of a killing machine that has been spreading through this forest for millennia. The dead trees it leaves behind are visible across the landscape as patches of standing and fallen timber. The forest around it has cycled through generations of trees many times over. Individual trees live and die, some quickly, killed by the fungus itself. The fungus outlasts all of them. The forest changes. The network underneath does not. It weighs an estimated several hundred tons, though the precise figure is difficult to establish given the diffuse, distributed nature of the organism. It holds the record as the largest known organism on Earth by area, larger than Pando, the aspen colony in Utah, which covers roughly 43 hectares compared to this fungus's 890 hectares. Largest organism on Earth, also actively killing the forest it lives in. It's been doing that for 8,000 years, and the forest keeps growing back around it. Number 1. Stromatolites, 3.5 billion years, and still going. On the western coast of Australia, in a shallow, hypersaline inlet called Hamelin Pool in Shark Bay, there are structures rising from the seafloor that look like rounded gray rocks. Lumpy, unremarkable, about the size of large boulders or car tires. They sit in the shallows in clusters, half submerged, doing nothing visible. Tourists photograph them. Most aren't sure what they're looking at. What they're looking at is the oldest form of life on Earth, still alive, still building. Stromatolites are layered structures produced by communities of cyanobacteria, photosynthetic microorganisms that bind sediment particles and precipitate calcium carbonate as they grow, adding one thin layer at a time. The living mat of bacteria sits on top. The rock beneath is the accumulated record of every previous generation, compressed into stone. Each layer represents roughly a year of growth. The fossil record of stromatolites extends back 3.5 billion years. That's not an estimate with a wide margin of error. It's based on physical fossils found in some of the oldest sedimentary rock formations on Earth, including the Dresser Formation in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, where stromatolite fossils have been documented and dated by multiple independent research teams. 3.5 billion years ago, these organisms were already here, already building these same layered structures in oceans that contained almost no free oxygen. That last part matters. Cyanobacteria are oxygenic photosynthesizers. They split water molecules and release oxygen as a byproduct. For roughly 2 billion years, stromatolite communities were the dominant life form on Earth, and they were collectively the source of essentially all the oxygen that accumulated in the atmosphere. The event is called the Great Oxidation Event, and it occurred approximately 2.4 billion years ago. It killed most of the anaerobic life that existed at the time. It also made every subsequent form of oxygen-breathing life possible. Every fish, every insect, every plant, every animal, every organism on this list, and every person watching this video. The Greenland shark from Entry 1, alive because of stromatolites. Jonathan the tortoise, alive because of stromatolites. The bowhead whale, the bristlecone pine, the aspen colony in Utah, the jellyfish that doesn't age. All of it runs on oxygen that these organisms spent 2 billion years producing. The living stromatolites at Hamelin Pool survive there specifically because the water is too salty for most grazing organisms. The snails and invertebrates that would otherwise eat the bacterial mats can't tolerate the salinity. It's a refuge. In most of the world's oceans, stromatolites were outcompeted and grazed out of existence hundreds of millions of years ago. Hamelin Pool is an accident of geography that kept them alive. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage Area. A boardwalk runs along the shore so visitors can observe without stepping on the mats. The bacteria don't respond to visitors. They don't respond to anything on a human timescale. They just keep adding layers, one per year. The same thing they've been doing for 3.5 billion years. Still going. If you thought these were ancient, you're not going to believe our video on the most extreme environments where life still survives. Click here to watch, and I'll see you over there.